Oh, I'm sorry.
Good, okay, good morning. Buenos días. Muy bien. So I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Suzanne Pollard. She is the program officer for the National Institute of Mental Health Division of AIDS Research. I will particularly encourage you to contact Susie if she is listed as the program officer for the announcement. I particularly think that all of the program officers from NIMH are very nice. And Susie spent some time in Peru. So she completely understands all of the Latino cultural values of sympathia, familialism, and all of that. So, and she applies that during the interaction that she had with the potential um, applicants. Uh, Susie will share. Uh, We'll be sharing the future directors of NIMH research, insights on key pitfalls in implementation science, in NIMH HIV grants, and innovation in implementation science grants. Thank you, Susie, for being here today with us.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Mariano. And yes, I spent many years in Peru. And so we had some unexpected connections there, which is great. Yeah, so my name is Susie Pollard. Dr. Kanamori said, I'm a program officer in the Division of AIDS Research. I lead one of the two implementation science programs, and I'll some of you may know Chris Gordon, and I'll also share his contact information because he also leads one of the programs. But yeah, I'm just here I'm going to try to keep the formal presentation very short and high level, and then we can have some time to answer questions. Also, bear with me because I've been sick all week. So hopefully my voice will not give out. Oops. So I'll just start by giving just an overview of the Division of AIDS Research, or DAR's priorities, and discuss some of the different mechanisms at NIH overall, and then some of our specific notices. And then I have, there's a few questions that I was asked to kind of touch on, so I can go through those a bit, and then I can answer any questions that you all might have. So NIMH DAR, Division of AIDS Research, we support research. I think we're known for the behavioral implementation science space. We also have a division that's completely dedicated to basic and clinical neuroscience. And so we really support a broad portfolio of research to reduce incidence of HIV worldwide and decrease the burden of living with HIV. And we place a high priority on interdisciplinary research across multiple populations over the lifespan. So this is a word cloud that was generated from kind of public facing information about our portfolio, but you can see in this word cloud that dissemination implementation research is an important piece, mental health as well. Although I want to point out that even though we are within the NIMH, we do not require in DAR that all of your research include mental health aims. So that's, I think, a common misconception. We are interested in mental health. We have an entire program within our division focused on comorbidities with HIV and mental health, but it's not necessarily a requirement for us. So you can see we have research developing and testing strategies to increase HIV testing, timely treatment initiation, linkage, and adherence. We have a growing implementation science portfolio. We have research on pathophysiologic mechanisms of HIV-induced central nervous system dysfunction. And we also have a program that's entirely devoted to kind of data science approaches for prevention and treatment of HIV. So this is, like Dr. Kanamori mentioned, we have a wonderful staff. I really think we have a special group of program officers that are just really eager and really enjoy working with PIs. And so you are welcome to reach out. This kind of gives an overview, number one, of the different kind of areas of research that we focus on, from adherence, clinical neuroscience, mental health, data science, and then implementation science, but also kind of puts a face to the name in terms of the different program officers, and as well as our fantastic administrative staff that supports our scientific goals. And then we have our division directors, Diane Roush, and then Greg Greenwood was recently promoted to deputy director, replacing Pim Brower. So some of you may know Greg Greenwood as a PO, and he still works as a PO, but he's also our deputy director now. So we have a fantastic team, and we're happy to, if you aren't sure who to contact, you can just contact one of us, and we can also send you to the right person. Sorry. So I mentioned we have two different implementation science programs, although there's quite a bit of overlap. Chris and I work together quite a bit. My portfolio has a little bit more of a bent toward health equity. I think Chris's work also has lots of research that has a health equity focus. And really, broadly, we are interested in kind of implementation science approaches from, prevention, treatment, maintenance, and so across the continuum. We really, despite these kind of, saying that despite some of the narrower names of some of the programs, we have really a broad interest overall in implementation science. And then, so many of you know Chris Gordon. He really is kind of our, you're welcome to contact me about ending the HIV epidemic work, but he really has been spearheading that work. So he tends to be the best person to answer questions specifically around EHE if that's something of interest. But he's also been leading the implementation science program here for decades. So he's a great resource and a really great person to speak with. So this is a bit of a pause. This is something I just wanted to share because I think that this can be sometimes confusing because we have so many different acronyms. And so I wanted to very briefly kind of walk through what some of these different acronyms mean on the mechanisms, just so that you're aware. So I think we've moved recently from the acronym FOA, Funding Opportunity Announcement, to NOFO, Notices of Funding Opportunity. You'll see that some of these notices of funding opportunity may start with PA or PAR or RFA or NOSI, NOC. But just to give an overview, so the PAs generally are kind of these broader announcements that identify an area of scientific interest, but they'll have often standard receipt dates. So they may have, 3 receipt dates a year. In our case, they're, the January and May and September receipt dates. If you see an R at the end, that just means that it has a special receipt date that's different from the standard receipt date. So I think, but the idea is that the PAs or the PARs are kind of a broader identification of these scientific interests versus an RFA that is specifically usually around a more narrowly defined priority area. Often we'll have a single receipt date. Sometimes an RFA is issued multiple times. And those are usually set aside funds for an anticipated number of awards. So we may identify from our perspective an area that needs, needs a focused kind of mechanism to bring in additional research to kind of address those gaps. And so you can kind of, if you see an RFA, then that's an indication that that's something that we're particularly interested in. It'll also have its own special review panel. And then I think one of the most confusing ones is the NOCI. So the NOCI is actually not a mechanism that you would apply to directly. What a NOCI does is it describes a specific topic of interest to our ICs, but it's more of an indication. So I'll give you an example. So say you wanted to come in and submit an application to us that had a focus on implementation science. So what you might do is, and I'll just go here. So these are our kind of standard mechanisms, our PARs that are our broad mechanisms that you would apply to with any kind of investigator initiated award that you might want to send to us. And so say you wanted to do an R34, but it had an implementation science focus, then you would apply to one of these PARs, but then there's an area within your application where you could also cite a NOCI, and you could cite our NOCI that's focused on implementation science. So that would kind of be an indication to us that this application that you're sending to our PIR mechanism has an implementation science focus. And that may have been more confusing, but the most important thing is if you have questions about kind of which mechanisms to apply to, you can email us. It's always really, really important, I think, to contact a PO to kind of help you navigate kind of which mechanism might be the most appropriate mechanism, and then to help you understand when it might be appropriate to cite one of our notices of special interest as well. So these are our parent PARs or parent mechanisms. And basically you can apply, we have the R34, the R21 and R01 mechanisms. And these have the standing receipt dates. So if you have a project that is of interest to you, but may not be, that's kind of your own, that's not specifically like a KO1 mechanism or an RFA, then you can apply to one of these broader mechanisms. The R21 and R34 tend to be kind of more formative research. The R21 is only 2 years and a smaller amount of money. The R34 is often used as kind of we use it as a opportunity to kind of do often a pilot study and really generate preliminary data that can set you up well for an R01. And then I'm sure many of you are familiar with the R01 mechanism, which is the up to $500,000. And actually, you can request higher budgets through a formal request process. But that's one of kind of the larger mechanisms that we fund. So again, the R34, R21 are often used to kind of generate that preliminary information that can then set you up well for an R01 application down the line. Okay, so any questions about that? Because I think the mechanism part in particular might be confusing, but again, you're also always welcome to reach out to us. But any questions about anything that I mentioned so far?
Yes, I have here the microphone, so we can use it. So
okay,
Dr. Pollard can hear. So any questions regarding the future directions and emerging priorities?
Oh, sorry. So I should so if anyone has questions about our priorities generally or how these mechanisms work, let me know now. I'm going to also address some of the more specific questions in this list that I was asked to kind of speak to, but I wanted to pause before I started doing that.
Oh.
Okay, I'll just move on then. So yeah, one of the questions I was asked to speak to is future directions, emerging priorities. And I think one of the specific questions, I think those of you that are involved in the Ending the HIV Epidemic work are aware that previously we had a lot of a focus on supplements and kind of generating these kind of seed funding for generating preliminary data around the EHE goals. And this past year, we had kind of a larger, longer term project opportunity. And so I asked Chris to speak to that specifically. And I think what he said is kind of the strategy that was employed in this past year and this focus on longer term projects, given pending funding availability and such, is likely to continue. So I think the seed money has really, the pilot projects have generated some really amazing preliminary work. And so the idea is that these kind of longer term projects will be more of a focus moving forward. And in terms of the specific topics or foci that might come through around the EHE projects, I'm not really able to speak to those. My understanding is that there aren't expected to be too many surprises around what those foci might be. Also, so if you kind of look through, actually, what can be helpful, because we're not, as POs, able to say this RFA is coming out or, speak directly to the initiatives that might be coming down the pipeline. But one thing that can be helpful is to take a look at the NIMH Council webpage and look for the list of different council clearances that have gone through recently. And not all of those will translate into initiatives or funding opportunities, but it can give you an idea of kind of some of the areas of interest that we have and that might be coming up. So, for example, we had an RFA that was EHE aligned about a year or two ago, focused on implementation and social determinants. And we had kind of a council clearance that came through before that. So that's kind of a tip that you can kind of take a look at that list. But you'll see also, based on our recent grants that we have an interest in social instructional determinants, for example. You can take a look at all of our notices of special interest in that also. I can share the website later, but you can look at our webpage and see the specific areas that we have a particular interest in and want to kind of grow our portfolio in. If that makes sense. Any more questions about that? Okay. The other question I had was around common pitfalls around submitting implementation science grants. And I don't know if I can speak to any specific pitfalls that can be kind of applied generally across all implementation grants. All of the principles of grants personship apply. And so I think that for that reason, it's also really important to contact your program officer with a set of preliminary aims, and we can kind of help you think through some potential things to keep in mind, related to your specific concept. But overall, if reviewers are, I think, excited about your idea and have kind of a high potential for significance, then that puts you in a good position to, either address any specific, questions around approach and things like that, either in a resubmission or in some cases, kind of with the PO before funding. So I think the biggest things to make that case for why it's significant, why it's exciting, why it's innovative, and then generally, approach type questions or methods, designs can often be easily addressed. So yes. Any other questions? Any questions about pitfalls there?
Yes, Susie, during these past 4 days, it was a topic that was discussed several times, and it's the level of familiarity of the reviewers with equitable implementation science.
Okay.
So could you please share more information about that, because it was not clear, for us, what was the level of expertise that they have.
Do you mean in a specific review section or just generally?
The reviewers, whether
Okay.
they are familiar with implementation
Yeah.
science or whether they are.
Yeah, I mean, I think the majority, unless it's an RFA, most grants that come into Chris or my portfolio go through HIBI or PPAH. So those two study sections, we are the vast majority of our grants are reviewed there. And I think, there are, because we see a lot of implementation science grants and very, very squarely implementation science focused grants. So I think that the study sections both are very familiar with those. And I think that there's good representation for, kind of card carrying implementation scientists as well on those main study sections. I think just generally as for implementation science, especially if you're kind of doing newer kind of methods, one that kind of comes to mind is like coincidence analysis and things like that might not be super familiar to people is or even using like quasi-experimental designs and things like that. It can be helpful to just in your grant very specifically address, for example, if it's the study design, you say, we considered a randomized trial, but we decided for this reason related to, our community engagement and, understanding this in kind of a practical context, we chose an interrupted time series or something like that. So you can kind of head off those types of questions that you might get if people are less familiar with certain areas of implementation science. If that makes sense.
Thank you. And how important it is to show a strong partnership with community organizations or with corporations in the grant?
Yeah, I mean, I think from our perspective, from our division, it's incredibly important. You'll see it kind of reflected in our mechanisms and our notices of special interest. That for us, not only is it important, if we see it done really well, we get really excited about that. I think I see similar excitement from kind of reviewers if they see that piece is done very well. So yes, I would say in implementation science, that's a very important piece. Sorry. Let's see. So any other questions around pitfalls? Okay. So, and then lastly, sorry, give me 1 second? I'm sorry, I'll be right back. My apologies. Sorry about that. Yeah, and bear with me being secure. So the last question I had was on innovation.
I'm sorry, we have a question here.
Oh, sure, go ahead.
Yes.
Hi, Susie. This is Bernadine Waller. Question for you from Columbia.
Great.
So how, God bless you. I'm assuming that you're sneezing over there. Okay, so let's just say we pull together our specific aims page. How soon is too soon to be making contact with our program officer and to make sure, one, we're not wasting your time, but two, we're getting what it is that we need in order to move forward?
Yeah, no, I think generally I'm happy. I think most of us are happy to see early versions of the aims. I think it is helpful for it to at least be kind of a complete draft of the aims, but it does not need to be finalized. I mean, sometimes we may, for example, talk through it and we figure out that you may want to do a completely different mechanism, right? So those things are going to change. And I think all of us are also happy to meet multiple times if that's needed. So I think having at least the concept complete, but it doesn't have to be like a very polished or final version of that necessarily.
Yes, and I want to share that when I approach Susie and Chris, I have my first concept paper, and the advice was that this is too ambitious. So, because you did everything in your pilot doesn't mean that everything needs to go in the other one. So then we're starting to focus more on some specific component of my pilot studies. So that is so that actually you don't need to have the final version. They are going to guide you, and I will tell you what fits well with their with the NIMH priorities.
Yeah. Any other questions? So then the last question I was asked to address is around how to kind of show innovation in implementation science grant, especially since kind of by definition you're working with an evidence-based intervention that may have quite a bit of research behind it. So firstly, I don't know if you all are familiar with NIH Reporter. I can also send that link, but that can give you an idea first of kind of what we are funding currently. Because all that is public and also what we're not funding. So you might be able to identify some or that we're funding less of. So you might be able to identify some gaps there, and then you could kind of come to us and see whether those are gaps that we're kind of interested in filling, or sometimes there might be gaps because it's less of a priority. So NIH Reporter is something that you can look through and can give you an idea of what we're funding and what maybe we might not be funding, but we should be funding more of. Another piece, so I'm talking now more about kind of like the gaps, but this is there's an element of innovation here, but then also an element of kind of what we don't see a lot of, but we might want to see more of. We do tend to see fewer grants focused on re-engagement in care for those who've been lost to care. I'm sure for those studies might be more challenging to conduct in some cases, but we don't see a lot of those, and we think that it's an important area to grow. We see kind of fewer projects overall in the respond pillar compared to the other pillars of the EHE. And let me also pause to say, this does not mean you need to find this thing that we're not, right? Just because I'm mentioning this doesn't mean that other areas aren't also of interest and important to us, but just thought I would kind of mention these kind of gap areas. I also think that I'm always interested in, I think we're interested in studies that really are using innovative methods and designs or combining methods in innovative ways. As kind of an implementation scientist myself, like there are so many new or kind of really thinking about studies that in pragmatic context, for example, looking at type 3 studies or thinking about scale up or thinking about sustainment or bringing in methods like combining a larger kind of trial or with also some methods like coincidence analysis or things like that that help maybe understand some of the bring in some causal inference elements to the work, understanding mechanisms of implementation. So anywhere where we're kind of innovating methodologically, and then also really trying to understand things in pragmatic or real world context, I think is great. Again, studies that demonstrate really clear, meaningful partnerships with community are very important. And also, I recognize, also having been a researcher, like how challenging it can be to really sustain those partnerships. So for me, when I see research that clearly demonstrates that community true partnership that is of interest to me. Yeah, and I will say there are fewer projects that focus on dissemination. I don't know if there are any that purely do focus on dissemination. So, we see a lot of implementation work, but less of the kind of dissemination piece. So that's another area. Yeah, does anyone have any questions around that? No, okay. Well, that's all I have formally. I'm happy to stay and answer additional questions, but these are our contacts. So you can contact me or Chris. And if anyone in our division too, if you don't know who to contact, you're welcome to contact me and I'll just find who might be the best person to speak with. Sometimes we also combine and do kind of joint calls with PIs. For example, there might be a study around implementation science and mental health and HIV. So I might bring in Terry Sen, for example, who's fantastic. And we might do a call with both of us. So we tried to do our best to bring in the best people to speak with you. And yeah.
Yes, Susie, are there some conference that the program officer from NIMH tend to attend? So we can actually meet in person and share our ideas?
Sure. Yeah. So let's see. I think related to this, to implementation, I usually, and Chris usually as well, is at the Dissemination Implementation Research Conference, right? The Academy Health NIH DNI conference in December, which is held kind of in the DC area. I think I have 2 kids under 4, so I haven't been going to as many, but we have a lot of program officer representation at IAS and CROI and kind of the larger the larger HIV conferences. We will usually have at least one, if not multiple, program officers that might be at those. Yeah. If anyone has interest in mental health, every couple of years we host a global mental health, in global mental health. Every couple of years we'll host a global mental health conference. And many of us are there as well.
Okay, and another question I have is, are there some population or subpopulations that requires more, that need more research? I'm just thinking, for instance, like the transgender population, or is there something, some populations, some communities that should that do not have a lot of research?
Yeah, that is one thing, and we actually, if you take a look at NIH Reporter, that can be helpful. But generally, particularly key populations, but populations that are have a higher disproportionate risk of HIV or poor HIV outcomes is absolutely of importance. And for me, also, I think I have thinking toward health equity in my portfolio. That's at a minimum, we should be addressing a population that kind of experiences disproportionate burden, especially in the United States, where that's where the epidemics tends to be focused. So absolutely.
Okay, thank you. And I just want to add that if you would like to apply to a career development award, like a K or a diversity supplement or an F,
Yeah.
so Susie, you can actually connect the person with the right program officer in that case.
Yes. So absolutely. And is this group more kind of early stage investigator oriented? Is that correct?
Yes.
Here or not so much. Anyway, regardless.
Yes, they are many
Excellent.
early stage meetings.
Yeah, so I think, we have, like, yeah, we support the F and the K mechanisms. If you are thinking of an F grant, then Susanna Allison is our training director, and she kind of is the PO for all of those grants. But for the K awards, we tend to kind of assign POs based on the area of the research, as opposed to kind of everything going to Susanna. So yeah, feel free to reach out. We're super excited to talk with early stage investigators, people applying for Ks or people applying for kind of their first R grants. And I think Susanna being the training director, and then I have a particular interest in working with EISIs, having been one recently, and then just having an interest in training and such. So happy to talk to people about that.
Thank you so much for your great advice. And I'm sure that many of us are going to be in contact with you.
Yes.
Thank you.
And yeah, and that's what Susanna and I try to emphasize is really we are so approachable, I think.
Yes, you are definitely.
Having been, a student investigator before, I think I remember not even understanding who was a PO versus a grants manager special, etc. But we are here and we are a really great group and approachable and happy to talk with people. So don't be afraid to reach out.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Thanks for having me here.
Thank you. And
I
we are
wish I
going to
could have
be.
been there in person.